Hello everyone, Shannon here. Thank you so much for joining me today. In this video, I'm going to share with you a really easy and fun faux watercoloring technique using the MISTI. We're going to start our project with the Peony Bouquet stamp set from Waffle Flower Crafts. This set is perfect for this technique because there are individual flower and leaves stamps in this set, as well as these images have lots of lines, which will mean a lot more color to our florals and our leaves later. I'm going to stamp on some watercolor paper, but I'm going to make sure I stamp on the smooth side. Your watercolor paper has a rough and smooth side, and you just get a nice, cleaner, crisper image if you stamp on the smooth side. I arranged several leaves from the Peony Bouquet stamp set, and now I'm going to ink them up. I'm going to start with peeled paint distress ink, and I'm going to partially ink. I'm just inking the top portion of these leaf stamps. Once I've inked them up, I'll then go ahead and stamp the watercolor paper. After I stamp these, I'm going to move on to my next distress ink color. My next color is my darker color. This is Pine Needles Distress Ink. I'm going to partially ink once more, but this time the bottom portion of the leaves. To partially ink, you just angle your ink pad so only a small portion of the ink pad will come in contact with your stamps. It's pretty easy to do, especially with these mini stamp pads. So I went ahead and stamped the watercolor paper, and now I'm going to once more partially ink up the leaves with peeled paint, and I'm inking up the top portion again, and then I spritzed it with some water, and then I stamped it. This is going to get that ink kind of flowy and runny, and we're going to actually do a little painting with that. So I'm going to do the same thing with the pine needles. Ink up the stamps, then spray it with water, and now you can see I've got this kind of wet inky surface where my images are, and I'm just going to spread that ink a little bit around just to kind of fill in some of the white spaces a little bit, but I don't fill in all the white spaces. I actually like those a little bit. I like this slightly imperfect kind of watercolor look. I think it has a really pretty look. So I went ahead and dried that paper. I just pulled the panel out of my MISTI and then heat set it with my heat tool. I could have allowed it to air dry, but I was just being impatient. So now I'm going to add the final step to these leaves. I'm going to add the lines back in. I've grabbed my peeled paint again, partially inked the top portion of the leaves, and I'm just going to stamp my panel. Again, thanks to the MISTI, everything's lined up perfectly. Now I'm going to move back to my pine needles, ink up the bottom portions, and then stamp, and this just kind of brings out those lines again and adds just some more detail and some nice contrast. I'm now going to repeat this process for a flower. I'm first going to ink up this flower with Abandoned Coral Distress ink and then stamp it. After I've inked up the flower and stamped it in Abandoned Coral, I'm now going to do some partial inking with Barn Door. This is my dark, so I'm angling my ink pad here and trying to ink up the very center of the flower and where the petals meet the base of the flower. It doesn't have to be absolutely perfect. Just try to get some of that ink down there, kind of in those areas, because it will kind of beef up the look of depth and dimension. After I stamp that, I'm now going to ink up the flower once more with Abandoned Coral, spritz it with water, and then stamp it. And now the surface of my watercolor paper and my image is all kind of inky and wet. So now with my brush, I'm going to spread out some of that wet ink kind of over the petals, creating a little bit of a gradation, stopping just short of the tip of the petals so I keep some of the white of the paper. I'm now going to partially ink up once more with the Barn Door, just that center and where the petal meets the base of the flower, and then spritz it and stamp it, and this will kind of beef up those darks, and you'll really start to get a lot of contrast and it will really start to look like that flower has lots of depth. So I went ahead and dried that flower completely. Now I'm going to ink up the stamp completely, stamp it in Abandoned Coral, and now I'll partially ink once more the center and where the petals meet the base with Barn Door, and then stamp it. And just like the leaves, this last step just adds those lines back in and just adds some more detail, some more contrast, and I think it just is a really nice step. So now I'm going to do another flower with a different combo of inks. So we are basically just repeating the process we did before for the last flower. This time we are inking the flower up though in Festive Berries. After we've inked it up in Festive Berries and stamped it, we're going to move on to our dark, which is Seedless Preserves, and just ink up the center of the flower and where the petals meet the base. After we stamp that, we're now moving on to the second phase, which is kind of the water phase. So to start that off, I'm going to ink up the flower again in Festive Berries, then spritz it with water, and then I will stamp it. After I stamp it, I'm now going to do that little bit of watercoloring. So I zoomed in here just so you can watch what I'm doing. I'm just going to take that watered down ink that's on the surface of this flower and just kind of spread it out over the petal, trying to create a little gradation, and definitely trying to leave the very tips of the petal the white of the paper, just add some nice contrast. After I've spread that ink around, I'm now going to grab my dark again, ink up those dark portions, spritz it with water, and then stamp it. And that's my last step for the water phase. So I'm now going to heat set this with my heat gun. I could again allow it to air dry, but again, I'm impatient, I guess. I'm now going to move on to the final phase, which is adding the details back in. This step, of course, could be skipped, but I do like adding the fine lines back in. I first inked it up in Festive Berries, stamped it, and then did my partial inking with Seedless Preserves and stamped it. And again, this just adds those lines back in, makes them more pronounced, and I think it just is a nice final step. So I'm going to grab another flower here. This flower is from Waffle Flower's Zinnia stamp set. I just pulled it off, and I'm going to go for a yellow combo here. So I first inked it up in mustard seed, stamped it. Now I'm going to do my partial inking. This is really easy. Just going to ink up the center with wild honey and then stamp it. And with that, I've just finished the first phase, which is kind of establishing the base. Now we're on phase 2, which is the water phase. So I inked up the whole entire flower with mustard seed, spritzed it with water, then stamped. Then I'm now moving on to kind of taking that wet ink and kind of spreading it out over the flower, really filling in these petals. You can really see here on this flower how this really does help to fill out that flower more. Did of course leave some white spots because I like that variation. Now I'm going to ink up the center with wild honey again, spritz it with water, and then stamp. Just kind of get some of that kind of amp up those darks a little bit more. I went ahead and heat set that flower. Now I'm going to do the final phase, which is adding in those details. So I inked up the whole entire flower with mustard seed, stamped it, and now the last thing I'm going to do is ink up that center with wild honey and then stamp it, and I'm all done. And I'll hold up to the camera this flower so you can get a good look at it. Really, really pretty. I like the colors together. I think this is going to make a really pretty bouquet. I went ahead and die cut all of the leaves and the flowers out with the matching dies, and now I'm going to move on to my sentiment. For my sentiment, I picked out the Simply Said 1 combo from Waffle Flower. I picked out this beautiful scripty hello. I'm going to stamp it here on a scrap of white cardstock and VersaFine Onyx Black ink. I'm going to do some heat embossing, so I did apply some anti-static powder first before I stamped the hello, and now I'm going to grab some clear embossing powder and just dip my cardstock in that, and then I will heat set this with my heat tool. After I heat set this sentiment, I will go ahead and die cut it out with the matching die. I also die cut 2 other hellos out of just some plain white cardstock, and I'm going to adhere them together, stacking them one on top of the other to kind of create some dimension for the sentiment. So I'm just stacking the 2 blank hellos on top of each other, and then on top of those I'll stack my final heat embossed black hello right on top. And once I kind of get that all aligned, I kind of pinch the die cuts together, kind of grabbing the edges. That kind of helps me to get everything nice and aligned perfectly. And after I get it all aligned, I'll then set that aside to dry. I have a A2 card base here of craft paper, and I'm going to splatter some Gonzai Tombi white paint over the top of this. This is just going to add some nice interest to the background and complement, I think, kind of the white border that's on the flowers. So while that's drying, I'm going to arrange my flowers here. I have an acetate grid that I created. It's an A2 size, and I'm just using it to help me know the dimensions of an A2 size card front. And after I get all my flowers and leaves arranged, I grab some painter's tape and place it on top of the arrangement, kind of holding everything in place so I can flip it over and then pop on the back some foam squares. So now that the card base is dry, I'm ready to adhere everything together. I've already removed the backing on the foam square, so I'm now just going to kind of center my little bouquet here, my little arrangement, and then carefully remove my painter's tape. If you don't want to use painter's tape, you can definitely use press and seal. I just prefer the painter's tape. And now I'm going to finish it up by adhering my sentiment. Just going to grab some liquid glue again and add some glue to the back side of the sentiment and just center it here and stick that down. And once I have that kind of stuck down, this card is done. I'll now hold the card up to the camera so you can get a good look at the stamping, our faux kind of watercolor technique. I think this card turned out really pretty. I'm really impressed with how easy it was to create these flowers. These flowers have a lot of details and they could be very intimidating to kind of color yourself. So I think this kind of faux watercoloring stamping technique is just a really cool and different way to kind of not color your flowers, because I did very minimal coloring, just kind of spreading out the ink once they are wet. And I almost think they have kind of a no-line watercolor look, so it's almost like a no-line watercolor hack. So I hope you guys enjoyed today's card and technique. If you like any more information on the products I use, please check out the links below in the description. I'll also share links to my blog and my Instagram account as well. And if you like this video, I would so appreciate if you subscribe to my channel. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I hope you have a wonderful day.